Game data.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Game Data Podcast. Today, I sit down with Arnold Rauers of Tinytouchtales to talk to him all about how he manages the game data and scripting flow and generally makes amazing games with his mobile game label Tinytouchtales. We talked to Arnold all about spreadsheets, JSON files, CSVs, tutorial scripting, and everything in between, and I am more than honored to have Arnold as the first guest on the podcast. Enjoy.
Game data.
Welcome to the first inaugural episode of the Game Data Podcast. I'm here with Arnold Rauers, a famed designer, programmer, entrepreneur of the... you're the first mobile game developer I feel like I started to actually see at Tinytouchtales. You've a claim to fame of like some of the best mobile games of all time, personally. So I'm glad to have you for our first episode of the podcast to talk about some game data. Welcome to the first show, Arnold. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Kyle. Very happy to be the first candidate for your game data podcast. And yeah, thanks for the nice introduction. Probably not the most famous mobile developer, but I carved a niche, so to speak, in the last 10 years, I would say. Yeah.
For people who are just joining, which I think would be everybody in this case, the Game Data Podcast, the intention for this is to look at the data that exists behind games. So I think that a lot of people look at video games and associate it with graphics and shiny things and mechanics and all this stuff, and that all matters. But we are kind of peeling back a layer to say, what is the actual like stuff in the games? Like what's actually going into this thing that is allowing us to make these games? This is not just code. This is specifically kind of like the materiality of like, what is a stat? What is a character portrait? What is all this stuff? And so I chose Arnold because you had just recently released, I guess about a month ago now, Geo Gods. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 19th of July.
So Geo Gods is the latest in Tinytouchtales is Oov. And you posted this really great video that I'll link to in the show notes of kind of, I guess it was your design process around Geo Gods. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the video is mainly about the like very basic inspiration that I had for the game and then how I like worked up my way to a playable thing. And Geo Gods itself, it's with most of my games. It's kind of not easy to explain if you don't have it in front of you, but I would say it's a mixture between like a classic tile laying board game where you put stuff from your hand onto a game board, you fill up the game board until the game board is full, and while doing so you're trying to basically activate game tokens in the game itself to score points, and you have this kind of cascading combinatorics basically, because each tile in the game has an action and has a type, and then you can combine different types with different actions, and that's basically the abstract of the game. And it's a high scoring game, so to speak, where you just try to get the best score, and then you get scored over 6 games because the randomness in the game is also pretty high. So we have this kind of average score system. After 6 games you get your final high score, and thematically the game is about being a god, placing your minions onto a game board and making them powerful, and the minions all have like different elements like fire, water, and so on, and sometimes they complement each other, sometimes they work against each other, and based on the deck of cards that you get for each game, you have this potential of making good scores or not so good scores, but then you have to find the best combinatorics of what you're given in each game basically.
And so Arnold posted this video on Geo Gods going over all the stuff that he just talked about. And he had, I saw on the video, a picture of a spreadsheet, and I got excited and I thought Arnold would be great to talk about this, because Arnold, if you don't know, you ship about a game or 2 every year, I think, for mobile. Is that right?
Yeah. I try to have one out at least a year, but that obviously slowed down with the whole COVID situation a little bit. And our last game, not the last game, but the one before Cardcore Adventure actually was a 3-year project. And so But now after the big one, I actually want to do more games again because it's always more fun to work on a new project or on the next project basically.
And I think, so again, the reason I want to talk to you for this podcast is that there seems to be a sort of consistency across the games you make. You're not making games that are like wildly different independently of each other. They often, they share kind of a common graphic style, although Geo Gods is a departure from that. But a lot of your games sort of seem like they're working with the same material. And so from the outside, like obviously that's things like, illustrations, maybe using the same illustrator, etc. But I'm interested, again, on the Game Data podcast about, so you mentioned certain elements of things. So you mentioned tiles, actions, gods, minions, cards. I guess just like starting from there, do you have like a sort of primitive data structure, or when you define a god or a card, what is that actually pointing to on the back end? Is that a JSON file? Is that like a CSV file? Is that sort of your own language or something you wrote? Like what's the actual thing that exists under that? And has that been sort of consistent kind of across time in terms of the games you've been making?
Yeah, well, so I think I've gotten better with abstracting my game data. So when I started, so I have to just maybe real quick. So I'm not a programmer. I'm basically a designer who taught himself programming. And that's why I'm not the best in this field and not the most organized, so to speak. But
you ship games, so you're getting results. Yeah, you're getting results.
Right. Let's call it code that works on a level where you can actually ship a game. So, and for my two latest games. So I want to, because I think you want to focus a bit on Geo Gods, but Cardboard Adventure has even a bigger data backend, so to speak. But mostly I actually have a JSON file, but this JSON file sits actually in a Google spreadsheet. So this is maybe the first tool I can share here that I'm using is.
I'm gonna pause. So for those of you who don't know, Google spreadsheets, though that's a spreadsheet, notably not a nested format like JSON. So this is already, we're getting to some real good game data stuff where you have JSON in a spreadsheet. What does that even mean? Go into that.
Yeah, so maybe I should take a step back. So imagine a spreadsheet, and then in the spreadsheet itself, I have multiple columns depicting the types of gods. So I have like my type of god, like water or whatever. Then I have how many points this god can have. Then I have a basically string that says what kind of ability the god has. Yeah, basically information or abstract information about the god, what he can do and how he is basically imported into the game. And once I've set up this spreadsheet, I basically export it to a JSON format. And
so each row ends up being sort of an entry in the JSON array. So you mentioned the gods. So just to be clear, in Geo Gods, when you're talking about a god, you're not talking about like the 6. I guess those are gods, but they're talking about the cards. Is that correct?
Yeah, these are the factions. The factions of the gods. Yeah, I have the spreadsheet open. I can just go through. So I have names. For example, fire creature. 1 is basically the name of the first god, and then I have a type, which is fire. I have an affinity, which is desert. I have the card ability itself, which is a string that I make up basically, so I can identify the ability of the god, and that's basically the abstract data that I have in my spreadsheet.
And I think I'm looking at the video you posted. So I think this is the spreadsheet that you're showing at around 6 minutes and 20 seconds, where there's it's color coded by the color. So there's like red for fire creature. Is that the spreadsheet you're looking at? So so people can look at the spreadsheets. If you're listening to the podcast, again, we'll link the Geo Gods design video in the notes. But at 6 minutes and 20 seconds, there's a kind of a picture of the spreadsheet. And so as you said, it's kind of the data. So you're taking the spreadsheet, so you're constructing the data kind of in a specifically like tabular format, and then you're exporting it to JSON. Is there a reason, I guess, you didn't use CSV for that? Like, I'm interested in sort of choosing that specific output format. So you're using a spreadsheet. Obviously, Google Sheets is great. Why not something binary? Why not CSV? Why did you end up choosing JSON?
Yeah, for me, I think I used what's it called, JSON.net, like basically JSON extension for C# a lot in my work or in my game, and it was always the easiest way for me personally. Actually, I mean, if you ask why not the different format, because I haven't thought about using a different format, because JSON always worked for me and was simple. And the cool thing about JSON is always you can like read the data and you can like do quick edits inside the game engine if you don't want to export everything again. So that's always a plus, having a readable format, I think. I mean, obviously CSV could be readable as well, I guess, or something else if you look from that point of view. But but JSON always worked for me in the quickest and like most simplest way. Just serializing and deserializing into C# classes with JSON, and the JSON.NET framework is pretty straightforward.
And then
so that's why I was using it.
From the code perspective, again, like I'm so excited to talk about this stuff, and you get to be the first person. I love talking about serialization logic. So for your deserialization code, are you sort of deserializing the JSON into like kind of an anonymous data blob and kind of parsing it, or do you kind of already have the classes that you're deserializing directly to the classes, so the data is kind of populated as objects?
Yeah, the data is directly serialized into a class. When I have a singleton, like a globally reachable part of my manager, so to speak, that I can then query from anywhere and just pull the real data. Like, for example, all my affinities are enums. So I can just deserialize the text file into enum back, and then just query the enums, for example, when I want to know which type of god, for example, it is.
Right. You make all your games in Unity. Is that correct? And so
I have my Unity.
As like a fellow Unity person, I know about the import pipeline. So if you just put a JSON file inside of Unity, it's not going to do anything. It's going to sit there and be JSON. So if you're deserializing it, did you write like sort of a custom importer script that listens for changes, or when is the actual kind of data change? When are you actually deserializing the data? And I guess also sort of an additional question is, can you update it when you're editing the game in real time, or do you need to kind of like stop the game, re-import a file if there's a change? Can you patch? Like, could you actually change the abilities for the game now? Like, is it pointing to like a sort of a cloud JSON file, or I guess like what's that actual import process like for you?
Yeah, so I think the file itself, the JSON file itself, is static inside my asset folder. So I'm basically parsing that on initialization. So if I were to change something, I actually had to go in my spreadsheet, then change something there, export it again, and update the JSON file or the text file with the JSON data. Yeah, that's a pretty static way of doing it. So I think it would be probably feasible to have a connection with Google Drive inside Unity and then hot load it, so to speak, from a cloud server or from a server itself. That's probably possible, but in my games I just have this static method.
I've always found that it's been I guess it's worth saying, so for your teams, you typically are kind of the only programmer designer, is that correct?
Yeah.
So you're not really dealing
that
with
makes a big difference, I guess.
Yeah, you're not really dealing with sort of external teams. Like I know for our game, we just shipped Cantata. It was a big deal for us to be able to sort of let people iterate on the game without having to rebuild. But it sounds like for you, and it's fine because it's just you, right? Is that if you were to change a value in your Google spreadsheet, you would have to basically rebuild the game to get that data in. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. I mean, it's, as you said, it's a huge difference when you're the only one actually having to handle the data and the game itself. So obviously, if another programmer would have to have access to this would probably not be as feasible anymore, and we would have to have some kind of more dynamic system that actually is changeable from different places, basically, not just from the one file. Yeah.
And then, while we're looking at this data file still, so I'm looking, I can see how Kingdom Affinities kind of unrolls to an enum. You have ability descriptions, which look like they are Text Mesh Pro text because you're kind of tagging fonts. Yeah. I have two questions. One, we'll start with the ability descriptions. I see that there are pound sign things in some of the text. Like I see, like you say, so for line 34, Desert Creature 6 says lose one for each basically hashtag desert icon. Is that like, are you telling me about that? So are you kind of intercepting that text and then putting an icon in there? Or like, I guess, how are you managing that?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so I'm using Text Mesh Pro from Unity, and it has a nice feature where you can do like this rich text formatting where you can like change fonts and font styles and stuff like this. So you can like actually mark that up like an HTML text or whatever. And then also I have this is my like in quote unquote custom thing where I replace marked tags like with the hashtags with icons that basically display inside the text and through text mesh. Yeah.
And then so you're kind of intercepting that data. So you're deserializing this JSON, which is then basically certain fields are getting acted upon in a different way. So this description is getting kind of piped to TextMesh Pro. These descriptions are on the cards in Geo Gods. So how does the data actually get to the cards? Is that all at edit time, or is it kind of all at runtime? Does it get populated? Like how are you actually kind of building the card?
Yeah, that's basically a runtime. So when the card, I have a card prefab, and the card prefab has a TextMesh Pro field. And then when I basically run the setup routine on the card script, I basically look at my database that I basically set up from the JSON and look up the card itself, like the card name. And then I see, okay, card name has this description, and the description runs through my placement method where I replace everything that is basically markup. And then, the text is populated inside the TextMesh Pro text field basically, but this happens the moment the card basically gets created inside the game world.
And then when you say the moment it's created, is that like when it's being drawn, or do you kind of make them all when the game starts and then you kind of have the database of cards once the game is just launched?
In Geo Gods, the cards get so the deck, you think of a deck, the deck gets created in data basically. So my deck has a type of whatever card class, and in the card class I already have the data from the spreadsheet, and then I pull so when a card is drawn, I pull this out of a list of the deck, and then the card gets populated with the data. So the whole cards are basically there, but they're just data, and then from the draw action, basically, data gets pulled from the card deck list, and then the card itself is like populated. The prefab is populated with this data and set up. Like icons change to the correct affinities, text is set up, and
gotcha,
stuff like this.
And then I guess so the other part of this card data that I'm looking at, I'm really interested in this one. So cards have abilities. So based off the spreadsheet, it looks like all the card abilities are text. So just the first one, the first line, there's a card ability and it says lower mana gems by 1, gain 7. So talk to me about what that means. Not necessarily, I guess we can maybe intuit that's what it means in the game, but like, so we're going to get that text. It's going to get deserialized to our JSON object, and then what happens? Because that's obviously not an ability, that's just text. How does that become an ability?
Right. So in Geo Gods, I was pretty lazy with that. So maybe you can talk about Card Crawl Adventure after that, because there's actually a dynamic thing, but here it's super lazy. It's just like it's also like an enum that basically has like a value, and this enum refers. So once a card is placed on the board, the code looks up this enum. If it finds it, it runs a ability script, and this script basically is then sort of is like the action of the ability is basically performed, but it's just a hard-coded function that actually is called remove whatever one of each adjacent creature. In your case, like the lower mana gains for 1, gain 7. That's like a coroutine that actually has the same name that I just look up and then fire off, because there's like a static method there's no dynamic, like so you cannot like use basically keywords out of this to create new so new abilities.
If I said lower mana gems by 2, gain 7, it wouldn't work, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it wouldn't work, right? Yeah. So it's not dynamic. Yeah. In this case, it's just hard-coded actions basically. Yeah.
But the game's out, it still works. I'm interested. So this is the lazy version. Card Crawl Adventure, you said you were better about it. I don't know if you've posted anything about like sort of how the data was structured there, but so obviously this is a way where, again, saying this more generally, right, is that you basically parse a string and then you just run arbitrary code. There's not really, it doesn't sound like there's much data. It's not like you're crafting the abilities from data. Card Crawl Adventure, you said, sounds different. So tell me about how the ability system works in that one.
Yeah, right. So in Card Crawl Adventure, I actually looked up a few different card games, mostly, for example, Hearthstone, how they do the abilities for the cards. And they also work with JSON, and they have these interesting way of actually putting together stuff. So for example, in Card Crawl Adventure, I have the first thing that Card Crawl Adventure has ability triggers. So I have an on select trigger, I have an on deselect trigger, I have, I don't know, a card gets discarded trigger, a card gets blocked, card card gets attacked, all these kind of different triggers that I basically define in the code, and then I can match that with filters. So there I have a target filter system that basically looks through all the cards and then checks, for example, if a card is selected, if a card is a monster, if a card is selected after another card, if the card was already selected, stuff like this. And then I have an ability, pretty much the same like in Geo Gods. An ability, for example, deal damage is the like most basic thing. But in this case, I could combine deal damage with, for example, only 2 monsters above 3 health or something like this. So this would be like a more dynamic system, and I can have an action amount basically. So I can say it's 1, 2, whatever damage. It could be 3 damage, could be 4 damage, and with that I was it was pretty easy to create like cards in data and then just try out stuff pretty easily. So for that game, I had a
go ahead.
pretty complicated, I would say, system. Yeah.
So what was the actual authoring experience of those abilities for card crawl? Were you still in spreadsheets, or like were you hand coding JSON? What was the sort of way you were doing this stuff for card crawl?
Yeah, this was the same idea like Geo Gods, where I have like a big spreadsheet and Google spreadsheets, and I define all my stuff there, export it again into the game as a JSON, and then load that stuff in. But I could easily, like, for example, have a sword that does 3 damage to the next monster, and then in data add a sword that damages all monsters for 5, for example, within like 1 minute. Obviously, I would have to have a visual representation for the new card in game then, which is like a different problem, but I could prototype stuff pretty quickly with that. So yeah.
And then I guess, so for that system, it was similar than what you're saying, that I guess if we're looking at the Geo Gods spreadsheet, you had columns for each trigger. So it was like on placement, on selected, on discarded. Is that how it worked for card crawl?
Yeah, for card crawl, I actually had it in a way that I have multiple. So I could have, for example, a card could do multiple things at once. So a card can deal 1 damage and deal 1 bleed. Bleed is like a specific ability in the game. And in my data spreadsheet, I have actually stuff separated by slashes. So I have like on select in the select column, right? And then I have bleed and damage with a slash like separated. So I could read multiple actions.
I was wondering about that. Yeah, if you wanted to like stack, if you wanted to do like 3 things on 1 action, how do you do that? And so you're basically, it sounds like you're then parsing again. You're parsing the string into 3 separate options, and then say these are the 3 things that happen.
Correct. Yeah.
What is the this is jumping a little bit over the code side. So in the sort of architecture of the game, so if you have like reactions to other people's placed abilities, like how are you sort of managing that like stack, so to speak, of actions? Like what is you mentioned coroutines. Is that kind of like the bread and butter of doing this stuff? Or how are you managing that kind of, the stack of actions that come from reactions to placing cards and that sort of thing?
Yeah. It's mostly coroutines actually. So I'm a big fan of coroutines, and mostly I just have a very linear way of like there's a placing action, and the placing action triggers the card action, and the card action triggers whatever, and it waits until the card action is over, and maybe 1 card action triggers another card action, and the first action will wait on the second, and when that kind of stack of stuff is done, then the card is basically in Geo Gods' case, the card is discarded, the god is like scored, and then the game continues with the basically next turn, whatever, then new cards are dealt. So it's it's basically a long chain of coroutines that wait on each other in my case. Yeah.
And then I guess the commiserate coroutine question is, what do you sort of do about saving then? Because and especially in a card game, especially one on mobile, it's very easy to leave the game in the middle of a coroutine action. So do you like save like the state of the game that you get returned to, or do you just kind of reject and start over? Like if someone leaves in the middle of kind of your actions being performed, what happens when they return to the game?
Yeah, so for Geo Gods, we have very specific points where the game saves. So this is basically after new cards are drawn, it's the one moment where the game saves. So if you were to close or like completely remove the app, not remove the app, but basically close the app when you're inside like one of these long chains, then you would set back to the moment before you actually started the action of the cards. but since most of my cards are pretty deterministic, obviously there are parts that are random, but most of the stuff is pretty deterministic, so you don't have this super big advantage of like saves coming your way into better moves by closing the app. And I don't think that's like very much important for me, or at least from a gameplay perspective in my game. So but basically I have fixed save points, and then everything gets saved, like the complete state of the game, basically how the board looks, what gods are on the board, which cards are left in your deck, how many turns you have left, and all that kind of stuff gets basically again then put into JSON, and this JSON is then saved.
So just in terms of that specific structure, how are you kind of like gathering the save file before you save, right? So you have to get that data. Is that like, is it all in one place? Are you kind of talking to a lot of objects? Like what does the actual serialization process of saving for you look like?
So in my games, mostly I have like this game controller. That's again a singleton, so you can reach it from everywhere. Then I have a save game manager, whatever script that basically talks to the game controller and gets all the data. For example, so I know in Geo Gods which tiles have 4 icons, which tiles have 3 icons, which tiles have a god. Then first I think I go through the level itself, so just the crystals on the side of the level itself. Then I go through all the gods, where they're placed, what state they're in, like if they're already like changed from a different action. There can be actions that actually change god's type and stuff like this. So I have a bunch of data from the god class itself, and all that kind of stuff gets put into a big save class, so to speak. And this save class has then all the data inside, and this is then serialized again into a JSON, and this JSON is then saved with my plugin, which is called Anti-Cheat Toolkit, which is a Unity plugin that can save the data obscured in a format that is not readable.
Oh, that's good. That's interesting. Basically. I wouldn't even have to ask about that. Yeah, because I guess you could theoretically hack it if you wanted to like open up your phone, but you're using a third-party tool that you pass the JSON to that sort of obscures the JSON data, so it's not just saved raw on the phone.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unlikely that people, like the average iPhone user on the phone that plays my game, won't be like hacking stuff. But in the beginning, I did had some issues with when you have like in-app purchases, right? So you have like content that you unlock with in-app purchases, and then obviously there are these hacking sites that put out these pirated versions where you can unlock everything and stuff like this. So at least for the average user, that's not doable with this anti-cheat stuff. So at least it helps with very basic cheating or like save game manipulation.
Are you sort of size sensitive to save files on a mobile device? Like, does the iPhone or Android sort of restrict how big a file you're saving? And is that a thing you have to think about, or does it matter?
Yeah, I think there's a dedicated, so for example, there's a dedicated space on iOS where you can save game data from apps and stuff. And I'm not sure, that's something I would have to look up, but I know that, for example, iCloud has, iCloud is the cloud syncing part of iOS. This has some limitations. I think there's like a 5 megabyte limitation for data, for example, that you can instantly sync between your devices and stuff like this. But at most, I think the biggest save file for Cardgrow Adventure is like, I don't know, 1, maybe 2 megabytes, but that's it. So the save files, I mean, it's a lot of data in 2 megabytes, but it's still not that huge that I have like real issues with the size of the save files. Yeah.
In, I guess, Geo Gods or your kind of previous games, I don't remember off the top of my head that you can start multiple runs at once. You're kind of like, if I open like Card Crawl, I'm doing the last thing I was doing. So do you have just one save file that is persistent that also just stores like the actual state of the game? Like you mentioned in-app purchase unlocks, like is that getting saved alongside sort of the data of the game itself? And that's just one save file that you kind of are always updating? Or do you have older save files from previous matches? Or like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, well, I don't have like multiple game saves, so to speak. I save individual like modes. So if you start a normal game, for example, there's a normal file that is saved, and then if you not abandon that, but basically cancel that and don't finish it, you can start a whatever constructed mode game, and this is saved as well. So there are different save files, but each one is for only one mode. So if you want to start a new normal mode, you need to basically delete the old one or just restart the game. So it's only one for each mode. But then in most of my games, I mean, in the more recent ones, it's better organized because I had more data saving in mind and stuff like this, because they were also more complicated. I have this, like, I call that persistent data, which is basically the unlocks, the information that the game has in general about the player, like IDs, how much the player has played, has he played tutorial, which tutorial steps did he do, and stuff like this. And then I have this general save data. I have this high score save data class. I have a few save data classes for matches, like weekly and daily games. I have leaderboard sync data. That's something that's also pretty important. I think it's when you play a game and then somehow your high scores don't get submitted to the Apple Game Center or Google Play clouds, that you have some kind of backup for your high scores, so it gets synced later when you have internet connection again. And then I have a separate class that is actually the active save games, so to speak, for the individual game modes that I was talking about.
I got you. So you do split it up.
Yeah, in the end, it's one big JSON, but obviously it's like, how do you say, compartmentalized into smaller chunks that I definitely have access to without loading the full persistent data file, basically.
Right. Cool. That's good to know, or it's interesting to know. I want to take a small, like, a little left turn. One thing that's interesting is that in Geo Gods, you have a tutorial. And any game developer that's ever had to make a tutorial knows that it is notoriously difficult. Not because it is hard to teach the game that you made, but often because making tutorials is just a thing that games are not often set up to do. You have to kind of program a lot of one-off things to just do it. So I'm interested for Geo Gods, because there's no, to be clear, in Geo Gods, this is that I've seen, there's no other like sort of narrative-y scripted stuff such that a system would have already existed for you to have done a tutorial. So I'm interested in, how did you do the tutorial? Was it data driven in some way? Was it just coded with, like, a sequence of coroutines or whatever? How did you do your tutorial? And then, last thing I'll say too, for people who haven't played the game, which you haven't, you definitely should. The game is also pantomiming actions on the board. So it's not just like text that pops up. It's like kind of like doing stuff for you. So I'm interested to know how you did all that.
Yeah, well, so I have to embarrassingly say that my tutorials are mostly like big switch / if statements. So there is no data component here. What I mostly try is to have different tutorial steps that can be skipped between. So it is possible just for testing purpose, because I don't know, if you're not a game developer, maybe don't know that, but I guess a lot of game developers will hear that. You have to replay the tutorial a whole lot, and it gets super annoying if you play like tutorial step 1 to 500 times, because in step 6 something isn't right. And that's why I mostly, at least I try to have these skippable parts. So you have this structure of tutorial steps. It's like the overall step that has like a, whatever you can call it, theme, whatever that the player is taught in this step, and I can jump towards these steps. But mostly, it's like a linear guided thing where the player goes through. And as you said, I have a few like reactive parts where the player, for example, has to do an action, like for example, he has to play a god on the board, and then if he basically, for example, would take the wrong god, it's not possible, but it could be that he takes the wrong god. You would have to go back a step and then tell him, okay, no, you have to do it like this. So you have some kind of, especially in Cardboard Adventure, you have these kind of like, again, if statements that check if the action was actually the one that the player should have been doing, but he wasn't. And then you walk back a step and you basically let him retry, or you pop up info pop-ups that tell you exactly again what what she should be doing in the tutorial. And then for the automated part, it's just triggering the same coroutines that the player would trigger just by code, basically, not by interaction in the game.
I guess that's like is there do you have a way to sort of test the game generally then without interaction? Like, do you have a way to like send data to the game that says like, hey, do this thing without having to actually touch it? Is that something that you like have done, especially as someone who's like shipped a lot of mobile games? I know that the sort of iteration loop can be long if you're trying to build to a phone every time. I'm interested sort of in how you manage that.
Yeah, I'm aware of these kind of like automated testing things that you could run code just to mimic player input and then find like stuff that isn't working. But my games are so small that I never actually bothered to do this kind of testing. Luckily I have a pretty active test community that is super willing and super happy to break the game. So most of my testing actually is done by the community, and they find stuff super fast. So I never had a bug so severe that I had to do like machine testing basically to find it by like doing game actions 2,000 times over just to find the bug one time in these 2,000 iterations basically. So yeah,
that's nice. I guess like you're sort of mentioning the tutorial and like the woes of, not only are you talking about having to test the tutorial as a developer a million times, you're also testing how you did the tutorial. Like presumably if you mess up the check to see if someone did the right thing, your tutorial sort of falls out of sync and you have to kind of redo it all. Like I'm interested sort of have you done it differently in the past where you feel like it was sort of easier to iterate around scripted content like that? Or is this the way you've always done it? And then I guess what could be, better or worse, or what would your ideal be there?
Yeah, well, it always depends a bit also on the complexity of the game. So for example, or a good example would be my game Card Thief, which is this, it's a basically Thief-inspired solitaire card game where you play cards on a board in a 3x3 grid and you select cards to play them and you move your character, which is also a card on the board. And in Card Thief, I actually made lessons. So the tutorial is not one big string of lessons, but it's like single lessons that play after each other, and you can come back to the lesson screen and play individual parts of the tutorial, which was pretty cool. So there I definitely try to separate each tutorial step from another. So each part of the tutorial basically started with an empty board, and then cards that belonged to this tutorial part were put onto the board, which was pretty good, but was also very specific for that kind of game because it was hard to teach and had quite complex rules. That's why mostly for my other games, I mean, if I think about it, I don't know. I think most of the time I just try to come up with a script, so to speak, like a general flow of the tutorial, and then I just start typing away and just hammering my head against it until it's done. Then I try to test it with people, and if it's good enough, it's good enough. I know that's my weak point of my games most of the time, that my tutorials are basically a reflection of this kind of way of doing them. But again, I mean, I don't know. How did you do it in Cantata? Sorry, I didn't play Cantata yet.
No, it's totally fine.
Did you do really like data-oriented tutorials there? Could you change stuff around without actually touching the code there in the game, or how did you do it?
Yeah, so we basically built, there's a whole runtime editor in Cantata that we use to build the campaigns. So it's one of these things where we started out saying it's going to be like very simple, and we were like, it'd be great to be like, I think the Wargroove editor is like really good, or like the old Age of Mythology Warcraft 3 editors, like that's like the pie in the sky. And we kind of found ourselves actually ending approximate to those. I think that our editor is actually really good. And the way we did it was that we have a very robust triggering system. So you can basically have obviously you can like place units and whatever. There's like an editor that works at runtime. So we're not actually authoring anything at edit time in Unity. And then for the actual like actions that happen in the game, there are triggers, and triggers have basically timings. So a timing can be, there's 4 options. It's like game start, once, repeat, and there's one more. It might be like once per round or something. So that's like a timing. And then there's lists of actions and conditions. And so you can have any number of actions and any number of conditions. And so the way it works is basically that those are just data. So it's all also gets serialized. So it's these really small serialized classes for like actions and conditions. And then the conditions basically they have like some sort of inciting event, like the whole game is like event driven. So they subscribe to sort of the event in which they would check themselves. And if any of the conditions resolve to say that, hey, hey, I'm true now. It checks all the other conditions and then basically looks at the list of actions and executes them step by step. So we expose those as data in the editor. We built this like kind of insane editor system that allows you to do that. So we do it all in data.
Nice.
Which has been a lot of work up front, but is like what happens now is you can do anything. And it's really nice, but it did take a long time to kind of find ourselves there.
Yeah.
So it's that we would definitely start there if we started again. But yeah, so it's all data for us because we were hard coding it, but that was bad.
But you do use that for other stuff, I guess. It's not just for the tutorial, right? So
yeah, it's for the whole, every campaign. It's everywhere. And it's,
to make such a complex system just for the tutorial would be like an overkill. At least from my perspective, it's like you take like a year to make this super complicated system, and the player sees the tutorial and clicks skip.
But I will say like the hard part of it, I mean, I'm sure you encountered this too on Card Thief because of the sort of the rule set there was that, we did like 9 chapters for the Cantata campaign. Each of those is like, they're pretty long, like they're 2 to 3 hours each. Although some people take like 4 or 5 hours. So they're long kind of missions. And so the sort of surface area of actions and conditions was pretty big to like cover all that stuff, but it still turned out to do the tutorial because you're teaching such like basic intrinsic actions to the game. We had to add all these like weird actions and conditions that just don't make sense. So there'd be one where it's like, there'd be a condition which was like select a unit. And like you wouldn't really ever in a game have something that reacts to you selecting. Like that doesn't make sense. Like you wouldn't, like you don't have something that happens in StarCraft if you select a unit. Like the unit just gets selected. There shouldn't be any sort of action to that. But because we wanted to tie into those moments, there's a lot of stuff like that where one of the conditions is like close the region UI. So if the region UI closes, then like try to do the trigger. But we also had the ability to basically tag some of these to not expose them to the game at actual runtime unless you're playing in the editor. So like all these like really weird ones we don't actually expose to players because they like, I guess we could, but they're just sort of confusing. It's like, why would it do this? So yeah,
sounds cool. I mean, if there was something out of the box that could be adapted to like the simplest parts, as you say, select something, deselect something that you could reuse, that's definitely something I would use as well. But as you said before, my games are pretty similar and I could reuse a lot of stuff, but it's always very dependent on the things that happen in the game, and especially if you have different ways of teaching stuff. It's always like most of the time it's super individual and you have to have like a really specific thing that you want to teach the player, right? So not like I don't know. I always imagine that, like, for example, an FPS is just like, okay, that's the mouse, that's your trigger button, and then have fun. And in my games, it's like, okay, so here's like these type of characters, and they have actions, and these actions do these things, but you cannot do it in this way. You have to do this first, and it's always like this board gamey manual complex tutorial. It's I don't know. You have to have it in there because people are really reliant on it if they not familiar with my games. But on the other hand, it's really a pain.
Does any, like, I guess speaking of that, like, has there been stuff that sort of made the jump between games, like any sort of bespoke tooling or libraries or things that you have built in the past that kind of you carry through? Is there anything like that you have?
Yeah, maybe not like specific tooling, but definitely like ways of setting up stuff, right? So as I said, so the workflow of using a spreadsheet to outline the types and whatever of things, and then importing them into JSON and have this database that I can like basically pull information from. Stuff like this has made it from one game to another. I wish I would do more for UI. That's always a whole another topic now, but UI is also, I mean, how many times have I recoded close the UI, start the UI, whatever stuff. If there were some kind of templates that I could reuse in a new game, I would definitely use them. But yeah, again, it's like if you're the only programmer and your games are kind of small, it's I don't know. Is it faster to do it again, like copying a bit over from an old game and then just somehow like Frankenstein it into the new one?
Probably
or
not,
do you
right?
have
Like
to have
you
a
have
super
to
robust
you spend more time adapting
framework
it.
that takes a lot of time, as you also said, to set it up. And maybe it's then even not perfect for the new game, and you start like adding corner cases here and there again, and then you're at the same level of like detail work that takes the time. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, again, I mean, I use a lot of like I said, like my anti-cheat toolkit, like my JSON exporter, like my I don't know, I have this nice extension for the spreadsheets that exports to JSON, all that kind of stuff I reuse nowadays in most of my games when I start them. I have a few obviously extension methods and stuff like this that I use, but there's nothing like super specific to like data management that I have no like template or whatever you want to call it that I really copy one-to-one and then populate it with the same data from a game before.
Right. I'm interested too, because as like we have some fun stuff that we've been working on that I don't want to say too much about to steal your thunder. But one thing I've always found like about sort of data iteration, especially is like this, like when you're like, I think especially Geo Gods, and this podcast is not meant to be a Geo Gods podcast, but it did just come out and there you have a great video up about it. You show a lot of your iterations of the design to get to what the release thing is. And so I'm interested in what the data story is for that as well, because presumably your data is changing, which also means you're changing your deserialization target classes. Like, what does that sort of look like for you? Like, is the data actually stable as you're moving, or like, what does it mean to kind of update not only the design of the game, but the data for you as you're like working on the project and trying to find the game, so to speak?
I mostly start out with the prototype in the very basic form, where basically I think do everything in the code editor. So I don't have any data yet. That's when I'm still moving pretty fast, deleting stuff and adding stuff. And once I'm comfortable that I'm on the right path to actually have something playable or something that is like expandable in terms of gameplay or whatever functionality, then I take a step back and then I start with for example, the spreadsheet data stuff. That's actually pretty late in the prototyping phase, I would say. So I've learned my fair lesson there with the Card Crawl Adventure, because this was a game where we were in like 1 year where we were in a super heavy prototyping phase, and I threw out quite a lot of work that I already did for the card system and stuff. So for Geo Gods, I actually waited quite a long time to start with the correct with the real data abstraction of the gods. So, but mostly that's also very dependent on the game and individual from game to game, where I would start to bring in, for example, my persistent data class for saving and loading. I mean, and it's mostly the point where I have to do real debugging actually. So that's something when I need a game state that I can reload to try to replicate a game bug. That's where this kind of data abstraction, data saving really comes in handy, because seeing a bug once and then not being able to replicate the game state where the bug happened is like really annoying. And that's mostly the point where I start getting my JSON save file stuff in.
It sounds like based on, I guess, Geo Gods and maybe the other games, you're only kind of managing one save file. So presumably if a bug manifests, are you able to recreate the circumstances up to when the bug happened, or do you just have a save file of like right before it happened? Or I guess like when you're talking about introducing like structure to the game's data in order to replicate actions, how far is that sort of getting you? Do you still have to do all the actions itself, or does the save file allow you to kind of go to right where you need to be? How has that sort of worked for you, that debugging process?
For Card Crawl Adventure, we actually have this super convenient system where it's just a bug report button in the pause menu, and the player can like type in, okay, I do this, I select card on the top left, top right, whatever, and then my game crashes. That's the most of the bugs, and then they can submit this bug report, and it gets directly sent to me with their current game data, basically. And then I can manually like inject this into my saving system or loading system, and I can replicate the game state they're in. And most of the time I can one-to-one replicate their actions just by clicking in the editor. And obviously in the editor I have a lot of debug messages logging what is happening, and I can most of the time trace actually what's happening there. So that's a very helpful thing if you can like directly save on the player's device and send it via email or via server, whatever you want to do. I actually just have a simple PHP script that is sending me an email with the bug report and the JSON file in it. So I have this huge JSON file in my email and just copy it out, put it back manually into my game and then just test it. But that's actually really helpful. I mean, we fixed so many bugs with that.
And so presumably that has made it over between games. Even you don't rewrite that every time.
No, yeah, that would be just a simple like whatever 10-line script that just takes saves the game state, puts the game state class into a JSON, and then sends it to my PHP backend, whatever web server, and this web server sends it to an email address.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost at an hour. I don't want us to run too long, but I want to check in. Is there other like ways that you use data at Tinytouchtales to do kind of anything regarding your development that we haven't really touched on that you want to mention here before we start to wrap up?
I mean, we haven't talked about like versioning, I guess. I use like mostly just SVN, like Subversion to save my folder, my whole Unity project, and just save it on a SVN repository. So that's maybe something people are interested in. But besides that, again, I mean, I'm pretty like, I don't want to say unorganized, but I do stuff very like when they're needed. So I don't have this huge planning thing going on. I just like do my stuff, and if I realize, okay, just whatever saving or some kind of data abstraction is missing here, I add it to the game and then I move on. So there's no real like huge production schedule, or what would you call it, that basically lines out when we should add something that helps me with the data or stuff like this. So it's again, I think it's also, again, I'm the sole programmer of the game. I don't have any other programmers mixing in with the code. I don't have to really like manage other people. I can. It's like a curse and a blessing at the same time. I can just again ram my head against the wall how long I want to, and if it doesn't work, I do something else. And it's how I build most of my games. I try to reuse stuff, but in some cases I just do it again or do something different. And it always depends on how I feel at that very moment in the development of the game, basically.
I feel like I'll check in with you again in like a year or two once if you have more people ever work with you to see like what's changed. You're like, oh, we don't use spreadsheets at all anymore. Never touch them. But I mean, I'll wrap it up here. Arnold, thank you for being the inaugural guest to the Game Data Podcast. Do you want to plug anything, like your Twitter, website, where people can find you on the internet before we wrap it up? Yeah.
So again, thanks for inviting me. It was a really nice talk and way out of my comfort zone, I have to say. But hopefully a few interesting behind the scenes stuff at least were communicated here. So you can find me if you Google my name, Arnold Rauers, or Tinytouchtales, which is the working title of my game development studio. It's just me, obviously, but you can find both via Google, and then you can find my website where all my social medias are on. And I think you can look up my name and Tinytouchtales in the app stores or Google Play as well.
Great. And thank you all for being on the podcast. And we will talk to you all next episode. Not sure who we're going to get, but if you like this, let us know. Thank you so much, Arnold. And we'll talk to you again next time. See ya.
Bye-bye.